Year 11 and welcome to OCR History B Living Under Nazi Rule content videos. This video will focus on the Living Under Nazi Rule fourth theme, which is Germany in War. So our first slide here is on Germany at war between 1939 and 1942. So this is the beginning period of World War II, when Germany were doing quite well. So first of all, we're going to start off by looking at the war economy. So in December 1939, so it was decided that all industries must support the war effort, and military expenditure rose hugely. So in 1939, 23% of goods in factories were to do with the military versus 47% in 1941. So we can clearly see here that factories were told explicitly that they had to be making products that would contribute to the Nazi war effort. By 1941, we have 55% of the German workforce in war-related work, again showing the significance of the event. But production did struggle, so the number of aircraft had risen by only 2,000 between 1939 and 1941, and they lacked efficiency and central control as an organisation. So production needed a revamp. It needed someone to take control and change the way that things were, and that came in the form of Alpha, who in February 1942 was made Minister of Armaments and War Production. So he gave factories independence, but he did centrally control them through a central planning board, which gave them the organisation that they needed. And this was hugely successful. So first of all, factories began to make single products, and if you're only making one product, you're going to do that really well. So the quality of what the factories are now producing is much higher. More women are employed, despite the fact that Adolf Hitler didn't want this. There is a use of camp labourers, camp workers, so people who have been locked in concentration camps are now being used as slave labour effectively. So Albert Speer decides to do this, and this benefits the Nazi war machine. And they also excluded skilled workers from the military, so there was a decision made that skilled workers should not go to the front line, that they should stay and they should make resources for the war effort. In terms of shortages and hardships, rationing was introduced on food, clothes, shoes and coal, so the German people would have really felt the impact of that. There was a complex system which was points based on age and occupation. Some people did receive higher rations, so for example pregnant women would have received more rations because of the importance put on the next generation for the 1,000-year Reich. It did help to feed people, but there were long queues and the quality of food was reduced. So again, this is quite a negative, despite the fact that the war was going well at the start. And some of the poorest were actually better off. So as a result of rationing, some of them benefited. In terms of the changing role of women, we've got women were not conscripted into factories as they were in Britain, because Adolf Hitler did not want that to happen. He wanted women to remain in the home, remember. And in 1939, we had 760,000 women in work and 1.5 million by 1941. Now, despite the fact that we see an increase here, the overall population of women was 30 million. So therefore, we can clearly see that the indoctrination that Hitler put into women at the start of his leadership really had worked. Lots of women were very reluctant to go back to work. So his kind of U-turn on women being in work doesn't work very well. Lots of women want to remain now at home. The restrictions on the marriage loans, which stated that women had to give up their job, was lifted in a hope that that would encourage more women back to work. And from 1939, women aged under 25 had to complete 6 months labour service, which was again trying to plug the gaps of the men at war. In terms of bombing and evacuation, in spring 1940, the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, from Britain began a bombing campaign, and cities were raided 3 to 4 nights a week, so the German population really would have felt the negative impact of the war at this point. From September 1940, as a result of the cities being targeted, we had the child evacuation programme called the KLV, which began. This was not very popular. A lot of parents did not want to use the KLV, whether that is because they wanted their children with them or that they were worried about the types of families that their children would be given to. The take-up for the KLV remained quite low. Children below 14 stayed for 6 months in a rural area if they were part of the KLV, and children below 10 were allowed to be accompanied with mothers in the hope that this would encourage more people to use the KLV. Older children in the Hitler Youth camp were in charge, and the conditions there were strict and they were used for indoctrination. So life in the Hitler Youth once the war had started was not much fun. And as I said, the KLV programme was not particularly successful. Only 40,000 eligible children out of 260,000 in the capital city of Berlin actually joined the KLV, proving that this was not the most popular programme. So during World War II, there was wartime opposition to Nazi rule, and probably the one that you remember the most is the July bomb plot of 1944, so 1 year prior to the end of World War II. It was a plot by Colonel von Stauffenberg, who was a World War II officer, and his aim was to kill Adolf Hitler and remove the SS. He had been a victim of the war, so he was injured in battle. He'd lost an eye, a hand and fingers, and saw World War II as a complete disaster. He'd especially seen the atrocities on the Eastern Front and wanted to stop them as soon as possible. His aim was to launch something called Operation Valkyrie, which was originally designed to militarily combat potential civil unrest in Germany. But Stauffenberg and the conspirators modified the plan for their own aims, with the intention of taking control of German cities, disarming the SS and arresting key Nazi leaders in the wake of the plot by the use of the reserve army. So on the 20th of July 1944, Stauffenberg takes a huge risk by fixing an explosive to a table at a meeting that Hitler is present at. The bomb does detonate, but it was blocked by the table leg, and so Adolf Hitler survives. He uses this, Adolf Hitler does, really to state that, you know, God has saved him, that he's here to rescue Germany, etc. So he tries to put a spin on this, but is evidently hugely shaken by this attempt on his life. And as a result of that, Stauffenberg is executed following his attempted escape to Berlin and his arrest. So the Stauffenberg plot is a complete failure. However, it really indicates the fact that Hitler was losing control of his army generals towards the end of World War II, when the war was clearly going very badly. We've then got individuals. So we've spoken about Cardinal Galen before. Cardinal Galen was a Catholic who denounced Hitler's use of the euthanasia campaign, or Action T4, which, remember, was the killing of disabled people in Germany. So Cardinal Galen delivered 3 sermons criticising the Nazis. And Galen does survive, remember. Galen is not targeted because they do not want, the Nazis do not want the Catholic Church to make Galen a martyr. So he delivers 3 sermons, as we said, criticising the Nazis, focusing on terror of Gestapo, taking of church property, and most importantly, the euthanasia campaign. So Cardinal Galen, great individual to mention in the exam if you had a question on wartime opposition. We also have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Protestant pastor who was banned from writing and public speaking. He joined the Abwehr, which was the military intelligence unit, and he learned of the Nazi atrocities and tried to do as much as he could to fight against them. He helped Jews to escape to Switzerland, and despite his efforts, he was arrested and murdered by the Nazis, reinforcing the significance of this opposition to the regime. We then have the White Rose movement. So these, remember, a student group at Munich University who were led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, brother and sister. They had been influenced by the work of Cardinal Galen, who, remember, we've just spoken about with his speeches against the euthanasia campaign, but also Hans Scholl had spent time on the Eastern Front and had seen the atrocities that were taking place there. They produced anti-Nazi leaflets and distributed these throughout the university. And they were caught distributing the 6th leaflet in 1943. They were arrested, interrogated and executed, once again reinforcing the significance of their opposition to the Nazi regime. We have passive resistance, which seems very small and insignificant, but was still a huge risk for the German people to take. So it's very difficult to measure. It would have been things like saying good morning rather than Hail Hitler, listening to anti-Nazi jokes and perhaps retelling them, listening to foreign radio. Remember, we said the Volksempfänger didn't pick up any foreign signals, so it would be having another radio in your home that did give you access to that, so that you heard stories that were outside of the Nazi narrative, which would stop the indoctrination that the Nazis were trying to ensure would take place, and also the hiding of Jewish people. So these are all peaceful methods. These are all methods that perhaps people would get away with more easily, but still a huge risk for people. And this increases during wartime, especially after 1942, when the war starts to turn for Germany and starts to get much worse. Despite all of these stories that you should know for the exam, it is important to note here that opposition was only from a small minority of people. The vast majority of the German population did not know of the Nazi atrocities. There was a huge fear of the SS and the Gestapo. They were scared of the terror that was set up by these groups. And Nazi propaganda had also been highly effective in trying to tell people that the war was going much, much better than it actually was. Remember, there was initial success in the war between 1939 and 1942, and that did bring support from people as well. So these are the main reasons that opposition was there, but was not carried out by the majority of the German people. The phase of World War II was known as Total War, and this ran from 1943 to 1945. So Total War starts in 1943 as a result of the fact that the Germans were facing defeat by the Soviets and the British. So the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union in 1942, and this had been a huge, huge error for them. They had to split their troops. They were fighting in a very cold climate. They had to split resources. They were unaware of the terrain there. And they were now, most importantly, fighting a war on two fronts. And this leads to total war and to a complete change, really, in how the war goes for Germany. In February 1943, Goebbels announces at the Sportspalast in Berlin that Germany must do anything and everything to win. And that is this definition, really, of total war, throwing everything you can at the war effort. So let's have a look at the Nazi war policy, total war policy, and the impact of these measures. So first of all, Nazi total war saw women mobilised for the first time. There were 3 million women aged 17 to 45 called up, but only 1 million accept their call. Remember, we said that the indoctrination of women to stay at home had been extremely successful. So when Hitler wants the U-turn on this, it doesn't work particularly successfully. Anything that didn't contribute to the war had to end. So as a result of this, professional sport, magazines, non-essential businesses were all shut down. Shortages worsened, so rationing was a real problem. In August 1943, clothes rationing was suspended, and there was now a ration for food and for coal that was harsher. So lots of people really do feel the impact of the war going badly for Germany. And finally, we have the increase in propaganda. So German people were encouraged to embrace total war and really get behind the Nazi regime. This was not the time to show your disloyalty despite the war going badly. Allied air raids continue to get worse. So in July 1943, we have the bombing of Hamburg, which kills 40,000 people. In November 1943, we see Berlin attacked, and we have 500,000 German people left homeless and 100,000 people who are injured. And in February 1945, we have Dresden, which is bombed, which causes a firestorm which destroys the city, and 25,000 people die. So if you had a question on the war, it would be good to be able to utilise one or two examples of Allied air raids and the impact that these had on the German people during total war when the war was going so badly for the Germans. As a result of this, because of the desperation that the Nazi regime was facing, we unsurprisingly see an increase in the number of terror cases and the use of terror groups, should we say, in Nazi Germany. So we have huge numbers of refugees from the Soviet Union, which adds to the pressure. We have the shock of the July bomb plot, which we've spoken about on the previous slide, which leads to many more arrests and executions of people that are perceived to be threats in the military. And the Gestapo and the SS arrest 7,000 people who are connected to the plot, and they execute 5,000 of them, really showing the fact that the regime had been shaken by this plot and that they want to deter anybody else from doing the same thing. In July 1945, we see Goebbels announce some policies, such as 500,000 workers being conscripted to the army. The railway and the postal services are reduced because, remember, during total war, everything needs to be contributing to the war effort. Theatres, opera and music halls are closed, so life in Germany would have been very, very monotonous and worrying for people. There wouldn't have really been any escape during total war. The age limit of compulsory service for women raised to 50, again showing the desperation, the war is going badly. And there was an increase in forced labour. So by summer 1944, we have 7.6 million people brought to Germany, and these were people from occupied territory, Untermensch, who were being used essentially as slave labour for the total war machine. So in October 1944, we see the Volkssturm, which is kind of the German version of Dad's Army, if you've ever seen that. It was a civilian army created in October 1944, all males aged 16 to 60, who hadn't or who weren't fighting on the front, probably for good purpose, now had 4 days training. They had no uniforms, they had old rifles, and they were supposed to be the last line of defence for the Germans. This really does indicate the Volkssturm is very good evidence in the exam to just reinforce how desperate Germany were. In April 1945, Berlin was the only place in Germany that hadn't been occupied by either the Soviets or the West, and the Germans do fight till the end. There is a fear of the SS, loyalty to Hitler, and the propaganda was effective. And as a result of that, many Germans do keep hope that perhaps they can win. Despite this, in April 1945, Germany lose World War II. Adolf Hitler commits suicide and the SS burn his body. So that is the end of World War II. You need to know the two phases. So the start of the war, 1939 to 1942, generally speaking, things go well. And then total war, 1943 to 1945, things go very badly, which is all of the evidence that we've just been through. So the final video on Nazi Germany or living under Nazi rule will be on occupation between 1939 and 1945.